I want to do something to begin the talk that will give you a little flavor of some of the academic work that I've been doing for many years on the subject of economic inequality. This work has been entirely focused really on arriving at reasonable and accurate measures of the change of inequality on a global scale over extended periods of time. This is something which is largely carried out, as all good academic work is, by one's students. But the professor has the opportunity to present it and talk about it and claim it for his own. That's in the nature of inequality, you know. We have, over the course of some years, put together what we believe to be about the largest consistent set of inequality measures available anywhere in the world. And it's possible to, this is estimated household income inequality, as you can see, and it's possible to represent them decade by decade in a very simple way on a map with a color scheme that runs from the blues for relatively low inequality to the yellows and oranges and reds for the highest levels of inequality. This is the 1960s, and you can see nothing terribly surprising about the pattern. Countries of the developing world, such as we have measures for, have high inequality. Those of the developed world much lower. But as you go through time, the 1970s and into the 1980s and into the 1990s and on to the 2000s, you can see that the world has indeed changed. And I think this is a simple and I hope relatively persuasive illustration of the extent to which we have experienced a rise of economic inequality all around the world, with only a very few countries managing to withstand that particular trend. I'm going to come back to this a little later on, well, at the end of my talk, but I just wanted to give you that by way of illustration, and that's at a global scale. But I should like to bring it very quickly back to the level that one can see and feel directly. And it's, I think, especially interesting to talk about this topic here in Seattle, because this is a city where so many of the conundrums and issues relating to economic inequality are in plain view. This is, after all, the hometown, or in any event, the home county of a man who has widely advertised to be the wealthiest in the world, Esther's and my college contemporary, although I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think it would be more fair to say that he's, or is or was the wealthiest man in the world who was subject to reasonably accurate accounting and reasonably transparent disclosure. It's obviously not coincidental that this city is also a fortress on the technological frontiers, a focal point of one of the great processes of both creation and destruction in our time, and therefore, as a result, a place which is marked by the particular type of extreme wealth accumulation that technological revolution is capable of producing. One of the conundrums associated with that is that this is a city with a reputation of being, from a political point of view, reasonably progressive, in a state with a similar reputation. Although I deeply suspect, from having spoken to friends here, that it appears this way more to people on the outside than to people who observe it very closely. And yet, it's also a city of vast gaps between the wealthy and the poor, of unaffordable rents, displaced people, and as everywhere, of an enormous racial divide. So the kinds of things that I study from a very dry and almost abstract point of view are part and parcel of the lives of you who live here, as they are of the lives of so many of our contemporaries in this country. Let's take up this question from a more theoretical perspective, and I want to begin to do that by offering a contrarian thought, which is that at the least, economic inequality is not an unmixed evil. It is, after all, inequality is, after all, a universal condition. There is, never has been, any society that has successfully eradicated it entirely over any lengthy period of time. Efforts to do so in our lifetimes, in the China in which my wife grew up in the 1960s, for example, or in Cambodia in the middle 1970s, were notorious and epic catastrophes. Nor are even the vast rewards that flow to successful technological innovation and entrepreneurship necessarily a bad thing. The Harvard economist, we'll come back to Harvard one more time, Joseph Schumpeter, about 60, 70 years ago, stressed that these rewards have an effect on the larger society in that they draw a great many people of talent into endeavors and competitions that only a few can ever hope to win. But in doing so, they concentrate and focus the activities, the brains, the energies of the society in particular ways that advance technological progress more rapidly than would otherwise be the case, even though most of the people who join in this challenge, in this struggle, in this race, are going to fall by the wayside and end up with few, if any, of the rewards. Progress, in other words, requires its victims. And there is perhaps the somewhat consoling thought that at least technical monopolies rarely last all that long, since the forces of technological progress continually open up opportunities to destroy that which has just been created. And there are intrinsic advantages to enterprises that attack old problems from a new perspective and without the baggage or the pension commitments of the previously existing firms. That's perhaps the most extravagant defense of vast economic inequality that I think exists in the economic literature. If you look at the other great economists of the past, they tended to hold at least somewhat more tempered views, even if they were basically oriented to the free market. Adam Smith the Scots economist who's given credit for founding political economy, has a section in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, on the inequalities occasioned by the policies of Europe. It's an interesting section, and what he meant by that was the inequalities that stem from government-granted charters, patents, and monopolies, from the privileges given to the East India Company or the Hudson's Bay Company, to the restrictive rights of guilds or of masters to require long apprenticeships, excessively long apprenticeships, restraining the competition to which they would otherwise be subjected. Monopoly, then as now, was seen as a force that simply conferred privilege and wealth where it was not earned. And we have that complaint occasionally in our own time. Firms with excessively powerful patent control over their products. So I'm sure that complaint has never been made by anyone in Seattle. The English economist David Ricardo and the American at the end of the 19th century, Henry George, drew an important distinction, which much of economics in the 20th century has been at great pains to try to forget. And the distinction is that between profit, which is the necessary return to capital investment, entrepreneurship, the organizational capacity of the business person on the one side, and rent on the other, rent being the utterly functionless reward that accrues to ownership of land or other resources. Thorstein Veblen, taking up this theme in the early 20th century, wrote of absentee ownership in America. And the remedy offered by Ricardo and George was to tax the rent, tax the land, leaving wages and profits substantially untaxed so that they could be, so that labor and capital could be rewarded according to the contributions that they made. But land didn't need to be rewarded because, after all, it didn't contribute anything, at least the owner of the land did not contribute anything that required a reward. This was a philosophy, a theory, which, as you may imagine, was not terribly popular with landlords. And since in the American Republic, who should be entrusted with the writing of constitutions, if not men of property, that is to say, landlords, we have, at least in my state of Texas, a constitutional prohibition against property taxes at the state level. It's not accidental that such things got written into constitutional codes. And as a result, inequality is exacerbated by taxes imposed heavily on working people, payroll taxes, and on poor people, sales taxes, and in Europe, on everybody's consumption, value-added taxes. All of that, instead of being imposed on the wealthiest people who, in fact, contribute the least to economic activity. Karl Marx feared, or it would be more accurate to say hoped, that the concentration of capital ownership and the conflict between capital and labor and the tendency of the system to drive wages down to a minimum, creating the vast inequality between the propertied and the propertyless, between the bourgeois and the proletarian, would throw the system periodically into crisis and ultimately into revolution. And while there were communist revolutions, it actually never happened anywhere quite along that model. Particularly did not happen in the industrial systems that were the focus of Marx's own study and analysis. In 1919, young British economist named John Maynard Keynes, writing his extraordinary attack on the Versailles Treaty, noted that this outcome of the dispossession of the capitalists as a result of their of this inequality had not happened, and in fact argued that there had been an ongoing rise, and incontestably there had been, in the standard of living of the working classes, slow but nevertheless perceptible, and that was due to the particular approach taken by the capitalists of the Victorian period. As Keynes wrote, like bees, they saved and accumulated, and so the cake grew. In other words, they avoided the Marxian fate by relatively disciplined behavior. The problem being that that behavior could not always be relied on, and the First World War had demonstrated to everybody that it could go badly wrong. And that, it seems to me, is the problem in a nutshell. It's not so much in every case the existence of the inequalities as it is the behavior of those who hold the upper hand. Adam Smith wrote on this in what is, to me, the best sentence. It's also the shortest sentence in his entire book, but it's the most wonderfully transcendent sentence. He wrote, "Wealth, as Mr. Hobbes says, is power." As Mr. Hobbes says. I mean, I think it's a priceless comment. And that is indeed the nub of the matter. What matters is the power that wealth brings and the use and abuse of that power. This phenomenon is surely all around us. And one can make a handful of points relating the sources of wealth that we observe to the abuses of power that we also observe. A key instance of the state support of monopoly power in our world today is surely the too big to fail bank. The bank so large and so essential that it controls the government from which it derives its power and its charter. There was a time, way back in the 20th century, when it was thought that bankers were reasonably dangerous people and that no bank should be larger or more powerful than the government that regulates it. And this thought and practice gave us 40 or 50 years of relatively stable economic expansion. But we live clearly in a world in which no government is permitted to be larger or more powerful than the banks that control it. Right? And you can see this from the personnel that staff governments in both parties in this country, and you can see this from the attitudes of the creditor countries in Europe toward the just elected government of Greece. The key, or at least one, perhaps of many instances of power derived from rent, from the rental incomes, and particularly in oil and coal, the specific manifestation that we all are familiar with is the work of our modern-day citizens Kane, the brothers Koch, who have taken on the rather interesting challenge of coming to control the state legislatures of a preponderance of states in this country. That's to say, applying their wealth to acquiring politicians on a retail level, with the result that the House of Representatives has become an institution whose political control cannot be changed by the effective action of the voters because of the redistricting process. And that will be true for a generation or longer unless something dramatic happens in the politics of this country to rein in the effective auction of politicians that has occurred. And then there are more generalized and frequent instances of bad behavior by the merely super rich. These would be too numerous to list, although, you know, there are points of amusement. I'm sure I can get a chuckle from you just by mentioning the name of Donald Trump. See, I could. These are examples of people whose presence in society would be enormously ameliorated by the application of very strict income taxation. And I have to say, I have in my notes, and I was going to mention a second example today, and that was the name of the Honorable Mitt Romney. But on the airplane ride on the way up, I saw a headline saying he's not running for president. So a moment of Christian charity has prevailed, and I will take him off the list for the day. But of course, waiting in the wings, and in fact not in the wings, is my high school classmate Jeb Bush. So it's okay, we're not going to run short of people like this. The distinction between land rents, mineral rents and land rents on the one side, and the rents that accrue to the technology baron on the other, I think is worth dwelling on for another minute or two because it has implications for the correct political strategy. In the former case, it's clearly to reduce the power of those who live on those rents by direct and immediate taxation. In the latter, it's not so clear that this is the correct strategy because we have an interest in society. We've organized our pursuit of technical change and our presence in the world economy around the success of firms of this kind. And if they were not, we didn't organize it this way, we would be back in the environment of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, where technology was in the hands of large regulated corporations like AT&T and Bell Labs, or in the hands of the government itself through its national laboratories with a very strong military orientation, as everybody, I think, in this community can remember. And I'm not sure that that's a better way of doing things. In any event, it's not a way which we can recreate at the present time. So the question is not so much whether accumulation should be allowed to occur. Clearly they should at some level. The question is how long should they be allowed to persist. And there, I think the answer is reasonably clear. One generation is fine. But a second generation is too much. And there's certainly no reason to believe that the second generation of that wealth will be as deserving of having it as the generation that acquired it. And that is the function, of course, of the estate tax. And a resident of this community, Bill Gates Sr., I think did admirable work in fending off the efforts to some degree of his more predatory associates to abolish that tax altogether, but they really should now be strengthened. Because the function of the estate tax is not, in fact, not at all simply to recover accumulated wealth for the government. The real function of it is to put that wealth, which is idle for a time, back to work in the service of the larger community. And that is to say, to funnel it back into approved activities on a decentralized basis such as universities and hospitals and churches, theaters and museums and parks and environmental works and foundation activities. And this is not a bad thing to do. It has enormous advantages, in my mind, over the socialist model which has prevailed in Europe, which is vulnerable in a much more serious way to budget cutting, to the austerity policies. Institutions tend to be fragile if they rely too much on a single source of revenue that can be cut. And the effect of having a large and vibrant recycling through the nonprofit sector of these accumulations is to create a great deal of employment that would not otherwise exist, and has a lot to do with the fact that the US characteristically has had a lower unemployment rate than modern European countries. So I've spoken for quite a while now on what should be done about accumulations of great wealth, and the kinds of distinctions that should be drawn, and the kinds of policies that might be effective. I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about what should be done with respect to the other part of the population, those who do not have the great wealth to fall back on. And here I have to say, I am an enduring fan of the 20th century, in some respects. This was a period in which, for the first time, society organized itself in the United States and Europe and parts of the rest of the world in a coherent way to support and sustain a large and successful middle class on which a self-governing democracy could be built. So the elements of that, it seems to me, some of which are still present and are still very vital parts of our institutional infrastructure, need to be reviewed, and we need to remind ourselves what they are. Social insurance is perhaps the most comprehensive of these institutions. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food assistance, unemployment insurance, deposit insurance, disability insurance, an entire spectrum of ways to protect the working population from contingencies that are unpredictable, but that everybody will face eventually: ill health, old age, and other such problems. The value of these institutions cannot be stressed too much. 40 years ago, about 1/3 of the elderly population of the United States was in poverty, often very dire poverty. Today, the figure is on the order of 10%, a little less. That's the work of the Social Security system, nothing else. That population lives on Social Security benefits. They are, in many cases, not adequate. They could be strengthened, but their value needs to be recognized and affirmed, because these institutions continue to have enemies. Wage regulations, collective bargaining, but especially in a world where labor is spread out over many decentralized service sector firms, the minimum wage, extraordinarily important foundation of a stable and successful society. Seattle, congratulations, you're the leader on this. But don't rest on your laurels, Seattle. Get out there and proselytize. Right? Monitor your own experience. Spread it to the whole state of Washington, to the whole Pacific Northwest, to everything west of the Mississippi, and then come down and persuade us to enact it in Texas. Public goods. It's an ordinary thought, but there are many things which we consume in common. Environmental quality, public education, cultural facilities, the basic infrastructure on which we rely for transportation. Mitigation and prevention of climate change. These are the foundations of the common life and the commonwealth, now and in the future. They need to be a fundamental part of our political program. And the fourth thing I have in mind is employment, jobs. And here it seems to me worth saying a word or two about the relationship between jobs and technology. My fellow economists tend to be techno-optimists. They regard technology as an unmitigated blessing which will raise living standards for everybody. Well, it raises living standards for everybody who has an income with which they can afford to pay the cell phone fees that you are required to pay if you want to have a functioning cell phone. The difficulty is that technology has another side, which is that from the perfectly legitimate perspective of the business owner, it can be used to replace labor and cut costs. Cut costs, cut training costs, cut insurance costs, cuts all kinds of costs. And maybe the business does not do that normally in normal times, but when they've already laid off a large part of their workforce in a recession and they're coming back, they think again about how many people they need and how they can restructure their operations. And this means, and we've seen this in the last 6 years, that the private sector does not create new jobs as rapidly as our past experience indicates. And the digital revolution is especially, I think, striking in this respect because it aims at the vast body of office work, communications and information processing and accounting and all of that, that was built up in the 20th century. And if you want a parallel, just think about how the automobile revolution in the early 20th century displaced the horses, for whom forage was about 1/3 of agricultural land in 1910. Right? There were vast numbers of horses, and they did not find new employment by and large. Right? So we have to think in terms of jobs about not only what it is that needs to be done, but how it is we can create institutions that will provide that employment in a sensible and organized and well-regulated way. And of course, there are many jobs that we are now free to do, including the caring for an elderly population, which requires a lot of work that cannot be automated and cannot be replaced by information technology, but will only be done if there's some institution providing an income to the people doing it. And that's an enormous structural task where you cannot rely on private sector enterprise to create those jobs unless you first created the sources of income that will pay for them. Coming to sort of a conclusion at this point, I want to make 3 points about the larger economics of a more egalitarian society. A society where, as I say, the abuses at the top are brought under control and the instruments are in place to stabilize economic life for the broader population. First point relates this kind of inequality to the level of employment. Economists will by and large tell you that if you let the labor market run freely and have as much inequality as it will produce, that everybody will have a job. Empirical evidence based on the work that I and my associates have been doing says exactly the reverse. In fact, societies which are more egalitarian in their structures of wages tend to have less unemployment. And there are good reasons why this is so. Basic one being that if you have only a few good jobs and lots of bad ones, a few factories and many people out there as peasants or sharecroppers on the farms, People leave the farms to go find jobs in the factories, and there are many more people looking for jobs than there are jobs, and the result is unemployment. You see this everywhere. You see this in China, where the peasantry comes into the cities looking for construction jobs. You saw it in the United States in the 40s and 50s, when the black population of the South came up to the industrial cities of the Midwest. It is a function of inequality that unemployment results. The second point has to do with the overall productivity level of the country. One of the things that the countries of Northern Europe discovered and experienced, and in fact it was built into their thinking and planning in the 1950s, was that if they maintained egalitarian pay structures, reasonably egalitarian ones, they would put pressure on their backward businesses and benefit their more advanced businesses who can afford to pay the high wages. And the result would be an improving composition of employment and higher productivity and a higher living standard for everybody. That's fundamental to the way a country like Sweden rose from being about average in European terms in 1930 to being one of the richest countries of the world at the end of the millennium. It's part of a regulatory process that works to improve the quality of work and therefore the quality of life. And the final point, actually the second to final point, but I wanted to get your hopes up a little bit, relates the question of inequality to the issue of economic instability. And I'll put the point this way. A nice analogy for economic inequality is human blood pressure. There's a range which is acceptable. Within that range, having a lower value is generally considered to be better. It's healthier. Right? It's possible to go below the desirable range, and the result of that may be sluggishness, difficulty getting up in the morning, a lack of dynamism in the economic body. Zero, that's for the morgue, it's for the graveyard. Nobody should want to go there. And the final bit of the analogy, which is why I think it works as well as it does, is that when the number starts going up, the inequality number, the blood pressure number, you don't necessarily feel bad. Right? In the economic body, that's a credit boom, but it's a sign that you're heading for trouble. And that crisis, when it comes, can be very severe and very difficult to recover from. And that's something that we have already experienced in the wake of the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, and that we will experience again if we don't think seriously about how to deal with this problem effectively and in a sustainable way. Okay, now I'm at the final point. And the final point has to do with the work of a certain, by now extremely well-known French economist, who has made the argument that rising inequality is an intrinsic and unavoidable feature of capitalist society. There is a little difficulty with the argument, which is that it requires you to explain away most of the 20th century. But leaving that aside, I want to show you just a few more measures. And these are not measures of the level of inequality, but of the change over a certain period of time, 6-year intervals actually. And the color scheme is that a blue is a decline of inequality, and the yellows and reds are now increases. So if you just watch how this happens over the course of this period around the world, this is the late 1960s, This is the 1970s, where inequality starts rising in the countries that consume oil. It's still going down in the countries that produce it. In the 1980s, you see the effects of the debt crisis in Latin America and Africa. In the 90s, there we are, that's the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the Eastern European communist regimes, enormous rises of inequality. All the way through this period, rising inequality basically around the world. But then when you get up into the 2000s, actually you see something a little different. You see that in a lot of countries, this is not incomes, this is industrial wage structures, so it's a little narrower than incomes, but it's a kind of precursor for the income data. You can see that at least in this period, 2003 to 2008, there were substantial parts of the world where inequality was actually declining, according to our measures. It's true over much of Latin America. It doesn't show up so well in this data because of the phenomenon that Esther spoke of, Brazil working on its poverty problems, and Argentina repudiating neoliberal ideology and coming back to a more sensible strategy. In Russia, whether you like the Russian government or not, the fact that it had the fiscal space for high oil prices to develop its economy produced a lower inequality. And even in China, it seems to us that inequality, which rose enormously up to about 2002, peaked and started to come down in the second half of that decade. So the point being is not that this problem is solved. These are numbers that are declining from extremely high levels. The point is that there is nothing inevitable about rising inequality in the world. It depends a great deal upon the policies that you follow and the governments that you elect. And it depends a